Creepy glitches in the Matrix. Phone call from mom. I was a teenager when my mom would leave for work and leave me home alone during the day. She would periodically call to check if everything was okay. One day, I picked up the phone. It was her. We talked about everyday things, then I hung up. About 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. I picked it up, and it was her again. I joked, "Must not be going well at work, Mom, calling me again." She paused and replied, "I didn't call you today." My blood froze. To this day, I don't know who called. Dream before grandfather's death. One morning, I had an incredibly vivid dream where my grandfather, father, brother, and cousin were sitting on the porch of my childhood home drinking whiskey and laughing. It was a very long dream with no dialogue, just feelings and laughter. The next morning, I learned that my grandfather had passed away that night. Maybe it wasn't a glitch in the Matrix, but it was one of the strangest things that ever happened to me. Car intrusion dream. In 7th grade, I had a very vivid nightmare. A white van parked near my house, and a man got out, broke into our home, and killed my brother in his room. I woke up terrified at 3:00 a.m., couldn't fall back asleep, so I went to the kitchen. I turned on the light and looked out the window, and there was the same white van. A few seconds later, its headlights turned on, and it sped off. I vaguely remember this incident, but it left a deep impression. Mysterious gunshot. One late night, my grandparents were awakened by a loud sound. My grandmother swore she heard a gunshot, while my grandfather said it was just a car backfiring nearby. They lived far from others, though close to a highway. After debating briefly, they went back to sleep. 15 minutes later, the phone rang. It was my aunt. She said her husband had been shot by their neighbor 20 minutes earlier. The catch? They lived 7 states away from us. Prophetic dream about future girlfriend. I dreamed about a red-haired girl with light eyes standing at the intersection of 3 streets holding a purple suitcase and crying. 2 years later, we broke up at the exact same spot. Now, I live in an apartment building at that very corner and deliberately go out the back way to avoid looking at the place. Childhood encounter. My mom befriended a family I've known my whole life. When I was 4, I visited them on Halloween, and they took me door-to-door trick-or-treating. Fast forward 27 years, I married a woman who was born in my hometown but moved away shortly after. It turns out that this family lived right next door to her parents when she was born. I'm 3 years and 9 months older than her, so when I went trick-or-treating with them, they had an 8-month-old baby girl. That means I accidentally met my future wife as an infant and only saw her again 18+ years later. First day of life. There was a girl I once had a complicated relationship with. Later, we discovered that we were born on the same day in the same hospital, and our mothers shared the same hospital room during those first few days. Essentially, she was the first girl I ever met in my life, even though nothing came of our relationship. Polar Express memory glitch. As a child, my parents took me to see the Polar Express. One early summer morning, I suddenly remembered it and thanked my mom for taking me. She had no idea what I was talking about. Later that year, on Christmas, we went to see the premiere of the Polar Express. I sat there in complete shock because I already knew exactly what would happen. Strange phone call. When I was 12-13, my mom would leave for work and leave me home alone. She'd call periodically to check if everything was okay. One day, the phone rang, and it was her. We had a brief conversation about usual stuff like, "Everything's fine, don't open the door if someone knocks," etc. We hung up, and I went about my business. 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. I picked it up, and it was her again. We greeted each other, and I joked, "Must not be going well at work, Mom, calling me again?" She paused and said, "I didn't call you today." My blood ran cold. To this day, I have no idea who called. Afterward, we created a secret password. Unexplained sleep episode. When I was 14, I went to bed at my usual time but woke up 2 full days later. In a panic, I went downstairs and asked my parents if they knew I had slept for 2 days. they ignored me and told me to sit down and eat breakfast. No one cared enough to listen, so I let it go. I suspect my dad might have slipped something into my tea or food, but I try not to dwell on it too much. Suit mystery. I have one good suit among several others that are old and worn. 2 years ago, I bought a new suit that fit perfectly. After my father's funeral, I took it to the dry cleaner used for 15 years, located half a mile from my house. I dropped it off but forgot about it entirely. About a year later, I needed the suit again for another funeral but couldn't find it anywhere. I searched every closet, drawer, and storage space in the house but found nothing. Finally, I decided to visit the dry cleaner, thinking maybe I'd forgotten to pick it up. When I arrived, the employee checked the system using my name and phone number. She told me I'd never been a customer there. I insisted, explaining that it was the only dry cleaner I'd ever used since moving to the area 15 years ago. Even my parents and sister used them. She confirmed that no one in my family had ever been listed as a customer. Confused, I went home, opened my closet, and there it was, the suit, hanging in the center with the tag from the same dry cleaner who claimed I'd never existed as a customer. Temporal loop on parking lot. About a year ago, my mom and I were standing on the lower level of a small shopping center parking lot. She was grabbing items from the car before heading inside, and I waited nearby. Across from us was a large white SUV. For some reason, I decided to watch it closely, which I rarely do. Suddenly, a family emerged from the store: an adult, a toddler in a carrier, and a little girl. The father loaded them into the SUV. My mom and I watched the little girl intently the entire time. Once they drove off, we entered the store. As we approached the entrance, the same family walked out: father, toddler, little girl, and the same shopping bags. My mom and I exchanged horrified glances. How could they have re-entered and shopped in the few seconds it took us to walk to the door? A worker from a nearby shop also noticed and seemed equally baffled. Could the little girl have been stuck in a time loop? More stories on our channel.